Baruch Hashem Yahweh, bless the name of Yahweh, and Shabbat Shalom. The title of this week's topical teaching is The Feast of Trumpets and Feast-Keeping Logic. So turn with me to Deuteronomy 12 or 16 or Leviticus 23, whatever your preference would be. But people have contacted us, the ministry, over the years, and there's always naysayers. What are you guys doing? You can't keep the feasts. You're not really keeping the feasts. What are you doing? You're just going camping. You're just getting together. You can't keep the feasts, and you're not supposed to keep the feasts. Don't you know that the biblical feasts are only if you're living in the land of Israel? And again, many people get discouraged and they go, well, we're not actually going up to Jerusalem and we don't have a Levitical priest. What are we doing? Well, let's have a look at keeping the feasts and using feast-keeping logic. Because obviously, most of us aren't living in the land. And if you look at Deuteronomy chapter 12, it says that as the children of Israel were leaving the wilderness, they were about to enter into the land of Israel, biblical Israel, Yahweh said, and you shall be careful how you are to observe it when you go into the land, meaning the feasts of Yahweh. Why? Because within the land of Israel, there were a bunch of heathen inhabitants that they needed to rid out of the land. And their way of worship was not the way that Yahweh desires to be worshipped. So if we unpack all of this down, the simplicity of keeping the biblical feasts is you're gathering in the hopes of touching your inheritance. Not the inheritance of the nations, not the traditions of men, but you're anticipating touching your inheritance that comes from Yahweh. Because the restrictions that are found in Deuteronomy 12 and Deuteronomy 16 about feast keeping were in relation to keeping the feasts set apart to Yahweh. If you're going to do these things, if you're going to even attempt to do it, even today in the 21st century, then how you do it and your whole approach to showing up is what is key. How you do it and your whole approach to showing up, that is key. Yahweh does not want you commingling. He doesn't want you doing what you would normally do in the world if you were to go hunting or camping or poaching or whatever it is you do. Keep those things out of it. When you show up, wherever it may be, it's in anticipation, of touching a piece of your inheritance. The other option is just go with the pagan traditions of man and stay in the world. But those of us that have a biblical worldview, we are looking to touch the netherworld, right? We're trying to get a glimpse of the heavenlies, or you just open your eyes and look around and you'll have a glimpse of this pagan world. It's everywhere. Why would we want that? So the restrictions in Deuteronomy 12 and 16 is all about restrictions on commingling worship with foreign gods when the children of Israel went into the land. Meaning, Yahweh doesn't want you to do a tel dan. Yahweh doesn't want you to go and steal the Pope's Dagon fish hat. And neither does Yahweh want us to go to Burning Man in Nevada and say, oh, we're going to go and do the Feast of Tabernacles down at Burning Man. No, because you're commingling the world with Yahweh's feast days. And that's really what he's saying not to do. If we go all the way back to Genesis, we can see in Genesis, Bereshit, chapter 1, verse 14, uses the word seasons. The Hebrew word seasons, of course, is moedim, which can also mean feasts. So Yahweh's moedim, his feasts, predate Egypt, predate Sinai, and predate the land. So whatever we're doing is actually supposed to get us back to the garden. It's supposed to get us back to our original status before we fell, meaning we're supposed to be touching a piece of our inheritance. Genesis 1:14 is a clear reference to the biblical feasts and indicates that Yahweh's feasts were from the foundation of the world. It's interesting, as we're living in the world but not a part of the world, that if Yahweh's signs and seasons in the heavenlies are pointing to his return through his Son, very interesting this week in the news down in New Mexico that the Sun Observatory was shut down. The FBI was called in and they've got it all hushed up. But the reality is we know that two orbs eclipsed the sun. One came in from this direction, and then a smaller one, it wasn't the same size, it came in from another direction and totally eclipsed the sun, and it was caught in these observatories. And people are saying, oh, Matthew, you've got your tinfoil hat on. Oh, they just shut down this one observatory, this one sun observatory in New Mexico. No. They shut down 6 other places at exactly the same time too that witnessed the same thing. The solar space cams that were shut down in Sydney, Australia, exactly the same time. Chile, shut down at the same time. Spain, shut down at the same time. 2 in Hawaii, shut down at the same time, and finally 1 in Pennsylvania. So my tin hat is actually looking like maybe something's going on in the heavenlies that we're supposed to be watchmen for. Is it Planet X? Is it Nibiru? I don't know. There are people out there that are way more proficient in their studies on Planet X, Gil Bouchard being one of them. Anyway, what we do know this week that 2 orbs of differing sizes moved in and eclipsed the sun from 2 totally different directions, and it was caught by people that are astute and looking to the heavenlies, because that's the Mazzaroth, because we know that Yahweh has put his signs, and we're starting to look through the Bible into a biblical portal of reality that connects us back to Genesis 1:14. Why do I keep the feasts? Because I am a watchman, and because you are a watchman. And we don't want to be looking at the traditions of men, which will lead us into folly. We need to connect with our inheritance. The children of Israel, before entering the land, the children of Israel kept the Passover. So the biblical feasts aren't just, oh, you can only keep the feast if you're living in the land. Well, no, the children of Israel, they kept the Passover and many of the other feasts when they were in Egypt. The Feast of Unleavened Bread, Shavuot. Even before coming to Mount Sinai, they were keeping the biblical feast of Passover and unleavened bread. Before receiving the book of the covenant, before entering into the promised land. So that argument is very flawed. Oh, you can only keep the feast if you're in the land. Nowhere in the scripture is there a command to celebrate the feasts only in the land of Israel. Nowhere. So it's a very flawed argument. In Deuteronomy, Yahweh commands his people to celebrate the feasts where he has chosen to put his name. He put his name in me when I was 24 years old. I know that for sure, and I've never been the same. And he has put his name in you, and you know when that happened. And if you don't know when that happened, then you're not born again, and you've got a bigger problem. So you've got to know when he put his name in you, because then you had a change of status and you touched your inheritance. And the moment you touched your inheritance, you can never be the same, because you've tasted and you shall see. These are the biblical realities that we strive for. Why are we striving for them? Because we've been touched. Because we've been touched. People go, yeah, you've been touched, all right. But no, we really have. But what about the tabernacle? What about the temple? They're gone. They were destroyed. We can't keep the feasts. Well, Paul teaches us that the saints, you and I, what are we? Yahweh's temple. We're his temple. So now that we are expected to what? House his very presence through the Holy Spirit within us, and he has chosen to place his name in you through the Holy Spirit. 1 Corinthians 3, 1 Corinthians 6 explain that in detail. So based on this scriptural logic, it can be reasoned that the saints, you and I, can now celebrate the biblical feasts wherever Yahweh leads us to do, whether it's in the land of Israel or not. Because where two or more are gathered, there so is he in their very midst. And we know that Yahweh inhabits the praises of... He doesn't inhabit the praises of his people. I know we've been taught that, but the Bible does not say that anywhere. Yahweh inhabits the praises of Israel. And when Israel, a dedicated people that keep the feasts and his Sabbaths, that makes them his people. So many times people want to be called Yahweh's people, but they don't want to do the things that actually sets them apart to be Israel. Yahweh inhabits the praises of Israel, and by keeping the feasts of Israel, you become Yahweh's people. There's a step in that logic that many miss. Of course, that's Psalm 22. He's put his name in us. He's given us an inheritance. And you and I, we need to align ourselves with the hands of the prophetic clock. Because as these days tick on, we're out of sync. And getting into the feasts and the biblical feasts and the weekly Sabbath begins to put us in line and in sync with the Creator. How many people take a sleep aid to try and get their body to come back into its natural rhythm? How much more should we take a yearly line to get our body rhythm and our spiritual rhythm in sync with the Creator? Especially with all of these electronic devices in our heads, next to our heads, flashing at our eyes, we need to be in sync with the Creator, because the default is that we are bombarded by all of this technological rays that affect our body rhythms. The feast of Yahweh put us back in the rhythm of the Creator. And that's what's so important. We become more Messiah-like just by seeking his face. So to me, over the years, it's changed. I remember keeping the Feast of Tabernacles in 2005. I was down at Lion and Lamb Ministries. And I remember people were utterly convinced. Hurricane Katrina was going on. This was it. It was the coming of Messiah. We're not even going to be departing this camp, because this is and now here we are all these years later. When my son Moshe was a little baby, like 2 years old, I remember on the Feast of Trumpets going out into my pasture and sounding the shofar. And my son came out and he was utterly convinced that the Messiah was returning, because he heard the sound of the shofar in the heavenlies. Do you remember that? We had to talk him down. The faith of a child, that's the expectation that we should have. We've raised our children. They have never, ever seen a Christmas tree in our house. They've seen them on top of cars, and we explain to them what's going on, and they think these people are lunatics. When you start to actually weigh the biblical feasts with the pagan feasts, these people over here are lunatics. Ours is concrete and tangible. It has a historic reality. Everything else is smoke and mirrors. All that to say this. 2 of the 7 feasts, we're in the 7th month, approaching the 7th month, can't even be kept in Jerusalem. They were kept at home. 2 of the biblical feasts are supposed to be kept at home. The Day of Trumpets and the Day of Atonement. There's no command in the Torah to go anywhere on those days. You don't have to go up to Jerusalem. You don't have to go where Yahweh has placed his name. And we know that the biblical feasts are forever. Forever means forever. And if you look at Leviticus 23, how do the feasts begin? What's the supreme feast above all feasts? The Sabbath. So let's follow this with some logic. They're an indivisible unit. They're an indivisible unit. In Leviticus 23, the Sabbath is mentioned at the head of the list of one of Yahweh's feasts, with the other 7 annual high holy days coming with the other 7 feasts. So there's a clear logic and implication here that the Sabbath and the biblical feasts come as an indivisible unit. If the 7th day Sabbath is to be kept, then surely so are the feasts. Think about it. And conversely, if you don't keep the 7th day Sabbath and you don't believe in keeping the Sabbath, then don't show up at the feasts. What's the point? It's hypocrisy. It's nonsense, right? So Yahweh created the seasons around the biblical feasts. So the feasts actually predate the seasons. Think about that. The feasts actually predate the seasons, because Yahweh created the seasons around the biblical feasts. Yet the world has no problem acknowledging seasons, right? But they're all connected to the pagan gods. Whereas we understand that Yahweh actually created the feasts, and then the seasons are around the feasts of Yahweh, because then it connects back to him. And that's what the world doesn't like. And again, not all of you have experienced that. But people do come and say, you aren't keeping the feasts, you're deluding yourself. But no, we are supposed to be watchmen. Watchmen on the wall. And the feasts of Yahweh are what keep us alert. They should keep you and me alert. They certainly do me. Yom Teruah, the Feast of Trumpets, is about a day of shouting. It's a time when you should be alert with a blood-tipped ear to hear the shofar, right? Yom Teruah. What establishes the timing of the feasts? The calendar. Oh, don't touch the calendar. We follow the covenant calendar, believing that that is the correct calculation of keeping the feasts. I used to be a lunar Shabbat keeper. I have gone through many calendars over the decades. But now I follow the covenant calendar because I believe through much study that that is the correct alignment. But it's not something that I'm going to argue with people, because everybody has to at least seek and search to find out whether these things are so, and do all of the crazy calendar math, which will keep you busy for years upon years and upon years. And you can have many arguments with people, and that's fine, but just don't invite me to those arguments. So how can we be consistent? Feast keeping does not rise and fall, because this is another thing. People are saying, you can't keep the feasts. You're not sacrificing animals. Well, hang on a minute. Sounds good initially until you start to use reason and logic, because feast keeping doesn't rise and fall with animal sacrifices. Think about it. According to this logic, if animal sacrifices have ceased under the Melchizedek priesthood in the new covenant, then so have the feasts, right? Wrong. If that were true, then the Sabbath would also be done away with. Why? Because animal sacrifices were a key part of the weekly Sabbath. In fact, being double the normal amount of sacrifices on the Sabbath. If you look at Numbers chapter 28, you can see there was a whole slew of animal sacrifices that were involved with the Sabbath. But we still keep the Sabbath. So, of course, animal sacrifices are not what the feasts are about, because the feasts predated the tabernacle and animal sacrifices from Genesis 1 forward. So it doesn't always work the way that those in the mystery cults would have us believe. Go back to Genesis. That's what the Father's calling. Newsflash, anyway. The sacrificial shedding of blood is still very much a part of the new covenant, isn't it? Some of you are looking nervous, but it is. It's just been a transference. That's the key word in the book of Hebrews, is transference. The shedding has been transferred to Yahushua's perfect sacrificial blood. We now rely upon that transference of Messiah's shedding blood for us. That's what Hebrews chapter 10 is all about. So the idea of sacrifice was never brought to an end in the New Testament. It was just transferred. It's a transference to the heavenly reality, which takes us back to Genesis. So I hope that I'm making sense to you, but I've questioned. I've got to be true. Over the years of my early zeal of feast keeping, and now I'm like, well, what are we actually doing? Why are we doing this? I mean, we're not really, we're not going up to Jerusalem. So I've had these questions too. But what are my other options? Go back and keep the pagan traditions of man, which I know are lies. Well, that's not an option. Sit at home and do nothing? Well, that's kind of lame. Or try and align myself with the Bible as much as possible in this world so that I can align myself with the Creator and His timing. That sounds like a good idea to me. And guess what? I get to gather with other like-minded people in anticipation of something bigger than ourselves. And we need that in a world that has fallen. So don't be discouraged. Don't be discouraged when you come to the biblical feast. And yeah, it doesn't quite look like it did 2,000 years ago. But we press on. We press on to the higher calling. The feast days and the Sabbaths are a part of our life and for our good. Don't be discouraged by some who try to lump together feast days and Sabbaths with animal sacrifices under a human Levitical priesthood, all as part of the law, and then say, well, that was only a type and shadow, and in fact, the feasts and everything back in the law, that was against us. And then they'll go to Colossians chapter 2 and say, you see, you shouldn't be keeping the feasts. Let's turn there. Why don't you turn there, for instance, Colossians chapter 2? Because some, in fact, many, I would say, would try and discourage feast observance by misquoting Colossians 2 and Ephesians 2. What Colossians 2:14 really says is that the handwriting of ordinance that was against us. But what were those handwritings of ordinance that was against us? In our previous studies, we've established quite clearly that the against us phrase comes from the book of the law that was added because of the transgression of the golden calf, and it was a witness against the children of Israel. In fact, it was placed on the outside of the Ark of the Covenant in a pocket as a witness against them. And in that chapter, you'll see that against them phrase multiple times. The writing that was against us, that has been nailed to the tree, of course, is the book of the law. And now we are in the redeemed Melchizedek priesthood. We can return to the royal covenant Torah. That's what Colossians 2:14 is talking about. Let no man judge you in meat or in drink, or in respect to a holy day, or of the new month, or of the Sabbath days, which are a shadow of good things to come, but the body is of Messiah. We've all heard many people use those verses out of context. This passage is used by some even to say, well, you should keep Christmas and Easter. And there's a lot of other pagan observances that we should be doing, and you shouldn't judge me because I want to do that stuff. Au contraire, that's not what this text is talking about. In fact, it says that Yahweh's feasts are a shadow of good things to come, and that only the body of Messiah is to judge how the feasts of Yahweh are to be observed. That's what the text is saying. Because in Colossae, they were doing the doctrines and teachings of men, which was actually getting into the occult and stargazing. They were also denying their flesh. They were having days where they would fast. They were getting into asceticism. There were particular days when they would deny themselves this, deny themselves that. And they were judging the biblical feast keepers because they were not doing their pagan holy days. So this text is not supporting doing away with the feasts. It actually supports keeping the feasts and only letting the body of believers in Yahusha judge how you should in fact keep them. Don't go to the pagan and ask him how to keep the Feast of Tabernacles. You'll end up with a Christmas tree, right? Not a good idea. So when you start to look at this in the whole context of Scripture, things make sense. What about Ephesians 2:15? That's another familiar text. Having abolished in his flesh the enmity, even the law of commandments contained in ordinances, to make in himself of twain one new man, so bringing shalom. Verse 14 explains that Yahusha broke down the separating wall and he made peace between Jew and that of Ephraim, or the Gentiles scattered in the nations, and he made one new man. How did he do that? He did away with the enmity clause, and the enmity clause, according to Galatians, is the book of the law, which is actually mentioned by name in Galatians itself. So neither of these passages has anything to do with abolishing Yahweh's feasts. Because I remember in the early days when I started keeping the feasts, many people would come to me from the Christian church and they'd be like, oh, you are losing your salvation. You have got to turn back. Have you not read Colossians 2? Have you not read Ephesians 2? This is treacherous ground. And I'm like, well, hang on a minute. That's not what this is talking about. The Colossians were into a bunch of stargazing and a cult and a bunch of pagan nonsense, which is kind of where the church has got to. In fact, let's flip this whole verse on what you think it says. Let's turn it around and look at it in the biblical context. We're supposed to be keeping the feasts, and only Bible believers should be judging what Bible believers should be doing. But if you've already been influenced by the stargazers and the pagan holidays, then you're not going to be a good judge of what is biblical and what's not, because you've already gone over to the dark side of the occult, which is magic, right? So it kind of helps you get that big perspective. So again, Sabbaths back in Leviticus 23 are the head of keeping the feasts. And then, of course, all of the feasts have their Sabbath high holy days too. Then, again, the title of this message is, of course, Feast-Keeping Logic. Let's look at the logic. Why would Yahushua implore us to follow in his footsteps and to do what he did, which included keeping the annual feasts, John chapter 7, 14, Mark chapter 14, and then why would he then abolish those same feasts as soon as he died? That makes no sense to me. Just being logical. His command to keep the Passover in Luke chapter 22, verse 19, even once he's died, as a memorial, as a remembrance, is very explicit. How do you get around that? 1 Corinthians 4, keep the feast. Very clear. So whether it's pre-cross, pre-tree, post-tree, Yahushua says, follow in my footsteps, keep the feasts. It's unmistakable. How can we possibly follow this command if the Passover were done away with after his death? Again, just looking at logic and reason makes no sense to me. And why do the churches today still honor Pentecost Sunday if the feasts are no longer in effect? That doesn't make any sense. That's not equal weights and measures. So why would Paul, whose ministry took place years after the death of Yahushua, say, I must by all means keep this feast that comes to Jerusalem? Those were his words in Acts chapter 18, after the death of Yahushua. Paul, of course, we know, was obedient to Yahushua's commands by keeping the Passover in 1 Corinthians chapter 11, as well as other feasts. You see Paul keeping the feasts in the book of Acts, chapter 20, chapter 27. This was 30 years after the resurrection. Go through the book of Acts. You'll see Paul keeping the feasts and the Sabbaths consistently throughout the whole book. Paul was taught, of course, by the resurrected Yahushua himself. That being the case, why was he not told that the feasts are no longer in effect? Of course, he wasn't told that. In fact, he said in Acts chapter 20, verse 27, that he declared the whole counsel of Yahweh, which includes the Sabbaths and the feasts. So this brings clarity to me, because I know so many people get confused. What should we do? Are we supposed to be doing this? The fact is, not only were the feasts not done away with in the new covenant, but they are for the watchman to pave the way for us into the wilderness. And I know some of you are like, I don't want to go into the wilderness. But be that as it may, listen to the alarm, the day of shouting, because Yom Teruah in the Hebrew, the Feast of Trumpets, Teruah means an awakening blast. And sometimes we have just got to be awakened up from the stupor, right? Or from the compromise, or from the worldliness that surrounds us all. Sometimes we just need to be awoken to a biblical maxim, to a biblical reality. Yom Teruah, the whole theme is, wake up, slumberer. Wake up, sleepyhead. Awake from spiritual slumber and worldly folly and start keeping biblical timekeeping. Try and make that shift to biblical timekeeping. The whole world is on a whole different schedule of slumber, right? It's September. Go to Fred Meyer. They've got a bunch of witchcraft out that doesn't even come for another 7 weeks. But they are just chomping at the bit for witchcraft to come out. Okay? And I remember when I was at Calvary Chapel, they'd try and rebrand it. Oh, well, we'll just have a harvest party. And I'm 24 years old, and I'm like, what? But that's witchcraft. Oh, no, it's not. I'm like, it's not? Well, we're not going to let the kids dress up like that. They can dress up like this. I'm like, but what? No, we're not doing that. Well, come on, you can come and teach the Bible. And I'm like, I'm not showing up at a place like that. And people would be like, oh, you're so religious. I'm like, well, I just came out of the world. I had a friend who was a Satanist. I know that stuff is not messing around. I do not want to get involved in that. Whenever anybody would open one of those cracker boxes with a Ouija board, I'm out of there. I could not even be around that stuff. I always knew that the occult was a reality that I did not want to be messing around with. I was one of those kids. We'd go around and sleep over at somebody's house, and they'd be playing with stuff like that. I would call my mum, and I would be picked up. I would not tolerate it. And I was lost. Now that I'm found, I have zero tolerance for evil. Zero. Because I want to walk in the light, and I do not want to walk around darkness. We won't even speak words that have that kind of darkness to them, because abracadabra, out of your mouth you create. So you want to create light, not darkness. All that to say this: we shouldn't be compromising with the world. Taking a stand is the Sabbaths and the feasts of Yahweh. 1 Corinthians 15, verse 51. Behold, I show you a sewed mystery. We shall not all die. This is what the Feast of Trumpets is about. Yom Teruah. But we shall be transferred, transformed, or changed in a moment, in the twinkling of an eye, at the last shofar. For the shofar shall sound, and the dead shall be raised incorruptible, and we shall be changed. It is concrete, tangible, and it's part of your future. Why wouldn't you want to practice something that's part of your future? Even though we're trying and muddling and mucking up together, we're not doing it properly, but we're trying. Or you can practice something that will take you to an early death, bring disease and deformation to your whole family for generations. Why would you do that? Choose life or choose death. I choose life. The feasts and the Sabbaths are kadosh, holy. Valentine's Day is for idiots. Sorry. It is. If you love your wife, take her out for dinner when you don't have to fight with a bunch of idiots for a table and pay 4 times the price for dinner. Why would you do that stuff? That's a day I'm staying home. For sure and for certain. I'll take my wife out on another night when everybody else isn't there. I'm being facetious, but you understand what I'm saying. Psalm 98, verse 6. With trumpets and the sound of the horn, shout joyfully before Yahweh our King. I want to reach for the blessing. Look what you and I receive when we hear the sound of the shofar. And I have literally had the testimony over the past 15 years of people that came into feast keeping, Sabbath keeping, and the enlightenment that you and I have been blessed with by hearing the sound of a shofar. It literally, somebody heard a shofar in a church service and they were like, what's that? And then they just sought after it and started doing research. And then the next thing they know, it led them into Sabbath keeping and keeping the food laws. And the next thing, they gave up Christmas. And all from hearing a shofar. I've heard that testimony from multiple people. Just the sound of a shofar literally called them into the biblical reality of feast keeping. Isn't that amazing? So it is a testimony. Psalm 89 verse 15. How blessed are the people who know the joyful sound. Do you know what it means? If I hear the shofar, I know what it means. And that may not mean much right now, but in your prophetic future, it's going to mean a whole lot. Leviticus 23, verse 23. And Yahweh spoke unto Moshe, saying, speak to the children of Israel, saying, in the 7th month, that's the month we enter into on Monday, in the 7th month, on the 1st of the month, will be a rest, a Shabbaton in the Greek for you, or a Zikron Teruah, which means a remembrance of shouting. A holy convocation, and you shall do no work, and you shall bring a fire sacrifice to Yahweh. Meaning, don't go to work, stay home with your family, have a holy convocation, have a blessed meal, blow the shofar, enter into prayer, and just be on fire as a family for Yahweh, and that you don't have to be a part of the world that day. And if that's all you do, praise Yahweh for it. That's a good day. That's a good day. And that's good enough for me, because you know what? We can build on that. I cannot build upon Christmas. I can't. There's nothing to build upon. It is a foundation of sand. This is concrete. You want to build your house on sand, or you want to build it on the rock? Build it on the rock. That's what the feasts and Sabbaths of Yahweh are for. And they are lights in the firmaments that will guide you in your prophetic future. I guarantee it. Numbers chapter 29, verse 1. And in the 7th month, on the 1st of the month, will be a holy convocation for you. You shall do no work. It will be a Yom Teruah, a day of shouting for you. So shout. The Torah doesn't say what the purpose of Yom Teruah is. The Torah gives at least one reason for all of the other feast days, and even gives 2 reasons for some. But this is one of only 2 holy days in Scripture not based on any historical event or agricultural activity, because a lot of the feasts are tied to an agricultural activity. But Yom Teruah and Yom Kippur are days that are marked by their prophetic implications in the future. There's something that's going to happen in the future that the Feast of Trumpets and Yom Kippur are warning us about. The calling up of the saints, and Yahweh finally saying, I am sick and tired of you heathen nations. I'm going to judge you. And that's going to happen. Because we're worse than Sodom and Gomorrah. It's way worse. It's way worse. It's really time to set aside for considering our relationship with Elohim. So I'm not going to go to work on Monday. I'm going to stay home, be on fire for Yahweh, be in the Word, be in prayer, go out in my pasture, sound the shofar, have a feast with my family, and consider where we are at as a family in relation to where Yahweh wants us to be. That's a good day, isn't it? That's a very good day. A day of self-examination, not only individually, but all of us corporately. A day of expectation. For me, it needs to be a day of revival. I want to be revived. I want to get ready. We've got the Feast of Tabernacles coming up. So there's much to be done. The Feast of Trumpets begins with, in the Hebrew, Ha Yamin Norim, or the 10 days of awe. So from the Feast of Trumpets to Yom Kippur, we have 10 days, which are called the days of awe, which are supposed to be days of self-examination and introspection. What's wrong with me? Why do I think that way? Why do those thoughts keep coming into my head? I thought I dealt with that 25 years ago. Well, hang on a minute. What's going on? I mean, just yesterday, I came home from work and I was like, and my wife's like, what are you doing? I was like, oh yeah, I was listening to this. And she's like, why are you listening to that? Oh, I was at the gym and I was working out, and yeah, I put on Euro club music. What was I doing that for? Because I was wanted to get the burn going. But maybe I shouldn't be doing that. Just because I grew up in the 80s when the rave scene was really big in London, that's not good for me now. Let it go, Matthew. Maybe I should be examining that on Yom Teruah. I'm just being honest with you. We've all got things like that we need to deal with. I think it's just going to give me, an extra little bit of cardio at the gym. But the reality is I'm bringing it home to my family. I'm in the kitchen making waffles. No, my kids are like, what is wrong with him? Because they don't know about that stuff. Praise Yah. Right? My wife's giving me a high five in the back there. So, again, Yom Teruah literally means to make a loud noise, not with dance music, but with the praising of your voice. And it can describe the noise made by a trumpet or the noise made by a large gathering of people shouting in unison. And there's two kinds of trumpet that are used in the Tanakh, in the Old Testament. We got the silver trumpets. Of course, you see the twin silver trumpets. These are pretty nice, aren't they? But there's also the shofar. I'm not going to blow these. Mind you, I am quite tempted, but I won't. So there are two kinds of trumpet that are used in the Tanakh. You've got the silver trumpet and, of course, the shofar, which is, of course, the ram's horn. Now, on the Sabbath, there was within the temple, and I've actually seen it in Jerusalem. It's a stone fallen now by the side of the western wall, and it was on that stone. It used to be up on the very corner, and it says, of the house of the blowing of the shofar. And it's actually got an engraving of a trumpet, and that's where they used to stand to, of course, bring in the feasts with the sounding of the shofar. And that's just, back in archaeology. You can still see that today. You can see it in Jerusalem. Each Shabbat, there would be two men with silver trumpets and a man with a shofar, and they would make 3 trumpet blasts twice during that day. But when it came to Yom Teruah, the shofar is the primary trumpet, not the silver trumpet. On Yom Teruah, a shofar delivers the first blast, and a silver trumpet would deliver the second blast, and then a shofar would deliver the third blast. So, history records that the trumpet was used for this purpose was in fact the ram's horn trumpet, not trumpets made of silver or metal that you can see in Numbers chapter 10. It says in Numbers chapter 10, verse 5, when you blow an alarm, then the camps that lie on the east part shall go forward. And of course, later, military, of course, took this from the Bible. You've got the bugler. That's a big part of military ordinances. Where did they get it from? Numbers chapter 10. Joshua chapter 6, verse 5. And it shall come to pass when the ram's horn makes a long blast, when you hear the sound of the shofar, the entire nation will ruach, or shout, a gadol teruah, meaning a great sound, and the wall of the city shall fall in its place, and the people shall go up as one man against it. I remember meeting this girl in Israel one time, and she could rip on a shofar so good that if she was close to a car, blow the windows out of it. So the sound, think about it, of all of the children of Israel going around Jericho, the sound of the shofar literally vibrates at such a high frequency. That's what caused the walls to literally explode and come falling down. That's really, you can examine that. It's frequencies. It's pretty amazing. Teruah, shout. Teruah, Psalm 47, verse 2. Clap hands, all nations. Shout to Elohim with the singing voice. Psalm 66, verse 1. Shout to Elohim, all the earth. Psalm 81, verse 2. Sing to Elohim our strength. Shout to the Elohim of Yaakov. And of course, Psalm 100. Shout to Yahweh, all the earth. How do you do that? Yom Teruah, Feast of Trumpets. Yahweh's asking us to shout to him, just to acknowledge him. So in your go bags that you've got stashed somewhere, pack a mini shofar, because you're going to need to sound it with the sound of your enemies. Until the future prophetic war, we must use Yom Teruah as a practice to the battle cry, to wage war, not against our enemies out there yet. There'll come a time for that. I'm going to use it to wage war against my inner enemy, which is my sinful, selfish desires. I'm going to use the shofar to break up some of those strongholds and what? Spend that time seeking and searching Yahweh, because I want to align myself with Yahweh rather than with the world. So the feasts, to me, they inspire me, even though I know we're not in the land. And the shofar was also sounded on the Jubilee year. Yahweh wants to set us free. He wants to set us free from slavery. In Leviticus 23, verse 24, Yom Teruah is referred to as Zikron Teruah. Speak to the children of Israel, saying, in the 7th month, on the 1st day of the month, you shall have a Shabbaton, a Zikron, remembrance, Teruah, blowing a Mikra Kodesh, a holy convocation. So Zikron is sometimes translated as memorial, but it can also mean that you mention something. What are we supposed to be mentioning on the Feast of Trumpets? Supposed to be mentioning Yahweh's name. Exodus 3:15. And Elohim said to Moshe, this shall you say to the children of Israel, Yahweh Elohim, the Elohim of your fathers, the Elohim of Abraham, the Elohim of Isaac, and the Elohim of Jacob has sent me to you. This is my name, Leolam Vayed, forever and ever. This is my Zechar, my memorial to all generations. At the Feast of Trumpets, you're memorializing the name of Yahweh. That's what it's for. Isaiah chapter 12, verse 4. And in that day you shall say, Baruch Hashem Yahweh, call upon his name, declare his doings among the nations, make Zachar mention that his name is exalted. Exalted. Isaiah 26, verse 13. O Yahweh, our Elohim, other masters besides you, you have had rule over us, but only in you will we make Zachar mention of your name. And Psalm 45, verse 17. I will make your name to be Zachar, remembered in all generations. Therefore shall the people chalel you, praise you, Le'olam Vayed. And I know right now, maybe you're comfortable in your community. Maybe you're comfortable. And this might not be resounding inside your spirits. But I have to tell you, there's been times when I've been geographically in locations where I have felt, as a believer, so alone, so desperate to feel the presence of Yahweh because of the strongholds, that if I even just hear the name of Yahweh by somebody else other than me, what that does, it revives my soul. I remember one time my wife and I were in London, and it was so dark, and the strongholds, and you're walking around with all these hijabs everywhere, and you're just feeling all this Islamic oppression. And then you're feeling all this sexual immorality and all this just bondage and craziness everywhere. And we were there, and we're just like, oh my goodness, we were new believers, and we were just like, we were like ducks out of water because we had been surrounded by a community of faith. We were going to church on Sunday, Wednesday. We were in small groups. And then all of a sudden we're off to England and we're like, the land where I grew up with all those temptations. And we literally were praying and we saw that the door opened and the wind came in and the presence of Yahweh came into our bedroom. And we felt his name in our very midst. And it revived us for the whole trip. So right now, many of you have been like, what is he talking about? I've experienced needing to hear the name of Yahweh just from somebody else's lips. So when you're out there, don't underestimate the power of the name of Yahweh on somebody who is lost, because you might be that very person that will be the instrument in change in their life. You don't realize that. And if you don't realize that, that's because you haven't taken pause from the world. An instrument of change. I have a student whose brother that I've known for many years. I hadn't seen him in 15, and he's a strong Christian, and he's been witnessing to his brother for years and years and years. And the other brother who's older, he thinks it's a bunch of nonsense. But how come when I had this one opportunity to speak into his life, you know what? I didn't have to do that, but he looked at me and he said, oh, you're saying the same thing that my brother's been saying. So are you saying that my brother's not crazy, that he's right? I'm like, yeah, he's right. He's like, oh. And the reality of this situation just weighed heavy. He just needed to hear it from somebody else other than his brother. He'd heard it. I didn't say anything different. Nothing new. But it was a different voice, saying and declaring the same message of truth. Sometimes you're that different voice. Just because of who you are, because of the stature or the station that you're in, that somebody needs to hear it from you. And you don't realize that until you do what Yahweh says. Zikron, mention my name. Just be bold and courageous. Just mention my name. See what I can do in this situation. I promise you, if you do that, you will comprehend what the inheritance is about. You'll touch it. You'll just touch it. Because it's amazing. And you'll walk away and you'll be like, oh my goodness, I wasn't going to say anything. I'm so glad I did. I didn't think I'd make a difference. But I did. Not me, but the Spirit in me. Just by being obedient, because the power is in his name. Zikron Teruah, the mentioning shout. It refers to a day of gathering with whoever you can. Whoever. If it's just you and your friend, you and your family. Public prayer in which you all, the faithful men, the name of Yahweh in one accord. Because Yahweh actually has a book for those of us that mention his name. Do you realize that? He has a book of remembrance. Zikron Teruah, the mentioning book. Exodus chapter 32, verse 32. Malachi chapter 3, verse 16. Revelation chapter 3. Revelation chapter 20, Revelation chapter 21. There's a special book for those that shout and mention the name of Yahweh in their life. The blowing of the shofar is sounding, and then there's going to be one day in our prophetic future a catching up and the resurrection of the dead in 1 Thessalonians 4. We know that John was taken up into the heavens in the book of Revelation by the very sound of the shofar. We know that there's going to be 7 shofars that are sounding when Yahweh judges the earth during the tribulation. In Revelation chapter 8. All this to say, Yahweh wants us to be watchmen. And as we enter into the feasts, we should observe and we should watch. What should we watch for? Well, in the day that you and I live, we're watching for different things than the saints before us. But maybe those saints were watching for the same things as us. I don't know. But as I look on the biblical landscape today, I see that Yom Teruah is a time of change, a time of proclaiming the last days. I think it's weird that they shut down that sun observatory. I really do. Especially when I see that they shut down 6 other observatories at exactly the same time, especially when I've seen the footage of an orb eclipsing the sun from this direction and then a different size orb eclipsing the sun from that direction. And then I'm listening to what Gil Brouchard and Planet X, and I'm just like scratching my head. And then the space station, the sabotage that just happened up there. There's a lot of strange things going on. And I'm not even talking about HARP. So yes, I think we should be watchmen. And we should practice the feasts because it's an opportunity for us to come together. Yom Teruah, the Feast of Trumpets, it's a time of change, a time of proclaiming the last days to a world that doesn't want to listen. It's a time to be watchmen. What should we be watching for? Well, quite honestly, Isaiah chapter 17 tells us, have a look at Damascus. It's going to become a ruinous heap, and it never has before in ages beforehand. And right now, does it look like Damascus could become a ruinous heap, and the inhabitants' bones will be melting within them because of chemical warfare attacks? Is that a possibility? But that's something that the Bible talks about will happen in the future. It also tells us that there is going to be a conspiracy against the children of Israel. There's going to be a conspiracy against conservatives and Bible believers in the world. It's such a conspiracy now that if you've got a YouTube account or a Facebook account and you start mentioning Bible things and doing Bible things Bible ways, that you could very well have your account shut down. There is a conspiracy, Psalm 83, surrounding Israel. Then also we know that the land of Magog has got big implications in our prophetic future. Look at Turkey, look at Iraq, look at Syria. These are things that I'm always watching because I'm a watchman. In Zechariah 6 and Revelation 6, I'm just waiting for a northern hemispheric judgment. We're in more debt now. We've been printing more money. Lehman Brothers disappeared in 2008 and we haven't corrected course. We've just been uploading and uploading more and more debt, but nobody's changed their ways. It's not sustainable. How long before there is a northern hemispheric judgment with an economic collapse that would then mean that those in the southern hemisphere, the poorer nations, would come under the effects of war, famine, plague, and diseases? Is that possible? Because that's what the Bible says to watch out for. Any of you that have studied economics and got some basic business sense, look what they've been doing since 2008. It is not sustainable. It is literally occult magic with fiat currency. It really is. How long can you continue to prop things up? Then we know, the Bible tells us in Isaiah chapter 21 verse 13, be watchmen, because there's going to be the rise. We've already seen the rise of Kedar, but you're going to see the fall of Kedar. What's Kedar? Well, all of a sudden, back in the 1920s or 1930s, out of the sand came Saudi Arabia, the rise of it. A poor nation full of desert migrant travelers. All of a sudden, they got more money than they know what to do with because oil is found in the ground. The rise of Kedar. But the Bible tells us that as soon as you see the rise and peak of Kedar, you'll see the fall of Kedar. You're going to see the fall of Saudi Arabia. They're connected, of course, to the US dollar and oil. Once that shifts with the Russians to the euro, it's going to be the fall of Kedar. Think about it, the BRIC nations. And then what about the woman, the harlot city of Mecca? These are things to watch out for. Then we've got the 10 kings. These are all things in our prophetic future. The 10 Islamic nations that give allegiance to Satan's throne, which is in Pergamos, which is in Turkey. Right now, where's Turkey at? They're an antagonistic nation, and we're seeing that there is problems there. And finally, we've got Tyre, which is, of course, southern Lebanon. So there is much that we should be watchmen for. And this month, as we now come into the time of the 7th month, the feast of Yahweh, to me, it's the clock, the hands on the clock, that just align me with the Bible and the hope and expectation that Yahweh is going to be a part of my prophetic future. Why do I keep the feasts? Because I get to. Because I get to touch my inheritance. Even though I know that, it doesn't look like it was supposed to 2,000 years ago. But 2,000 years ago, if they knew that people in the future were still attempting to keep the feasts, they would celebrate and they would shout and sound the shofar to rejoice that there would be people in the prophetic future that were still attempting to align their lives with Yahweh. And that's what I want for us. So I hope this brings some answers to those questions, because people have got discouraged, especially if you've been keeping the feast for over a decade and it didn't quite work out the way you thought it would. You know? Because I know that those people back in 2005 that expected Monty Judah's Sukkot to actually be the one that would lead them into the wilderness with Hurricane Katrina, most probably are like scratching their head now and going, well, yeah, where are we at? Well, this is a time of sifting, but it's a time of gathering, and it leads us into the biblical reality that Yahweh is still playing a big part in all of our lives. But for us to really understand that and anticipate, we've got to take a day out of the world, which is the Sabbath. And that then leads us into the biblical feasts. Start with doing the small things and it'll lead into the big things. Yes? So praise Yahweh. We thank you, Abba, and you would prepare our hearts these next 10 days of awe, of inward introspection and reflection, that you would clean us, Father, from the inside out, and that, Abba, that you would prepare your bride for the tabernacling together that comes shortly. We thank you, Yahweh, for your signs, for your Moedim, from Genesis all the way to the end of the book, in Yahusha's mighty name. Amen. Amen.